Welcome, everyone. Seems today we are starting so far with a somewhat smaller group, but we expect a few more people to join later down the road. But also today's topic is a bit more specialized in a way than the past few webinars that we did for Iconics. So today we'll talk about the integration of societal and climate futures. And we have two great speakers. So first we have Kris Ebi, Professor of Global Health at the University of Washington and also co-chair of the Iconics Committee. And she will talk about a specific report that the National Academy of Science wrote in the US and which she contributed to on exactly this topic of integration of societal and climate futures. And then a second speaker, we'll have Jana Sillmann from CICERO in Norway, who will speak about climate narratives, climate storylines, and a specific method of actually better integrating climate and societal futures. And so we start first with Kris' presentation, and afterwards we have time for some panel discussion with both of them.
Good afternoon, good evening. I'm going to summarize briefly a report from the National Academy of Sciences Committee to advise the U.S. Global Change Research Program. As you can see, the report focuses on global change research needs and opportunities for the decade from 2022 to 2031. The URL to download the report is listed. The report is freely available at the National Academies of Science. The committee was charged by the U.S. Global Change Research Program, the USGCRP, to identify the most critical global change risks likely to face the nation and the world in the next decade. While we were charged with looking at all of the global change risks, we focused primarily on climate change. We were also charged with identifying research priorities for natural and social science to both advance understanding and particularly to ensure that that understanding would support decision-making at local to national scales. We're also tasked with ensuring that our recommendations focus on policy relevance for decision contexts. This is a list of the members of the committee, 20 members, all experts in a variety of different disciplines, all brought significant expertise, input, and insights into the report. The report starts with focusing on the evolution of the focus of global change research, starting in the 1970s with a sole focus on understanding the physical climate system, to today where there is work on the coupling of human and natural systems. The report focuses, though, as we focus on the next decade, there needs to be a stronger focus on managing the risks posed by global change to the coupling of human and natural systems, ensuring that there is greater integration in the research to be able to manage the critical challenges the world is facing. Based on where the research is at the moment, particularly in the United States, the report recommends a new approach, noting that the traditional research that's been done, while it has provided very important insights that have been useful for policymaking at the broadest scale, is not fully meeting the needs of decision makers. That science-based policies to limit climate change and to manage its consequences need to be done at local to national scales. And those decision makers are not receiving the kind of information that they need to have informed policies. That new approach also notes that the USGCRP needs to overall have a program that's commensurate with the scope, scale, and urgency of climate change and other global environmental changes. The act that mandates the program specifically stated that the information that comes out of the program needs to be useful. And more than that, it needs to be usable and easily used. The report recommends focusing first on urgent risks to well-being. In particular, the report focuses on health, food, water, energy, transportation, economy, and national security. The committee selected these critical human systems based on our collective expertise of the kinds of issues that could be expected to arise in the decade between 2022 and 2031. In thinking about risk, we very much put ourselves in the framework of the 2030s, looking back at the kind of research that will need to be done to prepare the US both for its own security in these various systems and to contribute worldwide to the research that is needed to manage the additional climate change that we all know will be expected at 2030 and beyond. The report notes that risks to these systems arise from complex, multidirectional interdependencies and interconnections, that it is no longer possible to just look at one particular system and understand how climate change could interact with that system to result in an increase or a decrease in risk. That we need to understand how systems are working together in order to be able to increase resilience, increase sustainability into an uncertain future. Understanding these risks and reducing uncertainties will require an integrated, systems-based risk framing. The report notes that the USGCRP has done risk-based research since its inception, but most of that research is based within a particular sector and does not focus across the sectors in the ways that are going to be needed for the changes that we expect over the next decade. This is a very simplified diagram of the interactions between human and natural systems, noting that there's feedbacks between and across these systems. The report notes that the USGCRP has a very strong history of observations, modeling, analysis, and communication, particularly on the physical science side, and notes that the committee assumes that these efforts and activities will continue over the coming years. So there's little emphasis in the report other than to congratulate USGCRP for the work that it has done and to encourage it to continue that work, but to broaden it in ways that will provide more useful and usable information for decision makers. One of the recommendations in the report is to apply an integrated risk framing approach to identify the research priorities to provide insights to avoid the worst potential consequences of urgent risk to human and natural systems. We did not define worst, but used it in the general sense. The bullets provide some of the detail for this particular recommendation, again emphasizing that there is an urgent need to provide information for decision makers at all scales. We are not the first National Academy report, will probably not be the last, that strongly emphasizes investment in social science research. There's been a significant underinvestment in social science research in the United States. There is social science research going on, but it just has not had the kinds of investments that are needed to be able to provide the information needed to manage the challenges of a changing climate. Throughout the report, there is a strong theme on ensuring that research promotes diversity, equity, and inclusion. So to accelerate this integration, there is an emphasis on coupled human-natural systems and taking a more integrative approach to looking at these systems for understanding effective options at local to national scales. One of the examples, one of the themes that runs through the report are coastal systems. Our coastal communities, just like communities everywhere, are facing challenges from storm surge, from sea level rise, from higher temperatures, from water withdrawals, challenges to our infrastructure, our health, our well-being, and our livelihoods. There is a strong need for more decision support for mitigation and adaptation strategies. These, of course, are the two main policies that we have to address a changing climate. And note that it's not supporting mitigation and adaptation separately, but taking a look at how mitigation and adaptation can work together to create societies that are more resilient. We also emphasize that research is needed on how we can incentivize more research into the synergies and trade-offs between these risk management options, making sure that mitigation that is implemented doesn't create maladaptation and vice versa. The report notes cross-cutting research needs to support climate risk management. With all of the change that we've all seen over the last decade in terms of extremes, thresholds, and potentially approaching tipping points, there's encouragement to continue the research and where is needed to enhance the research on extremes, thresholds, and tipping points. Like everywhere else, there's a strong need for regional and local scale climate projections. The report, as I said, focuses on the United States, but there is also quite a bit of language about ensuring that the work is done, such as regional climate projection, is done in collaboration with other countries so that we can pool our resources and have better projections most effectively. You'll see the third bullet is on scenario-based approaches. There's both a discussion on the kinds of scenarios that we all know about, the RCPs and the SSPs. There's also discussion on growing work on scenarios that are developed with end users, the kind of work we've seen with some of the SSPs developing city-based scenarios, for example, in thinking about how development choices will interact with climate change. Across all of the research is a theme on equity and social justice. And finally noted that there are many tools coming up that can advance data and analysis frameworks. Exascale computing is one of the examples that's included. Overall, to achieve these kinds of recommendations, USGCRP itself needs to think about how it's going to support a risk management paradigm. The report has suggestions for the USGCRP to consider in terms of how it's organized and how it operates. I won't cover those at the moment, but you can find those in the report itself. A couple of final thoughts. One is a very strong emphasis on increased investment in social science research, that we're not going to be able to address the challenges we face, for example, with food security. Food security is not just about how much rain falls in a particular area. It's also about consumer choice. It's about farmer choice. It's about governance. It's a range of issues. And we have to look at all of these together to be able to more effectively design our mitigation and adaptation strategies. And finally, the committee urges the USGCRP to be bold when it crafts its new strategic plan. There's a real opportunity here for USGCRP to put forward a strategic plan that will really incentivize research that is needed to prepare societies for a more resilient and sustainable future. Very much want to acknowledge the committee members and the National Academy staff who were central to the production of the report. The review monitor and coordinator were incredibly helpful. The reviewers put in many, many hours and provided incredibly useful comments that improved the report. And finally, want to thank USGCRP itself for encouraging us to write this report and the funding that they obtained from NASA. With that, thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Yeah, thanks, Kris, for that overview of the National Academy of Science report with its recommendations. Now let's first move into the more concrete examples of how such integration actually of society and climate futures can be done before opening up for more discussion with all of the participants. So Jana Sillmann from CICERO, the floor is yours. You're still muted.
Yeah, unmute. Okay. So do you see my screen now? So as I will present live. So do you see it?
Yes, but if you go to display settings, we just need to swap the screen because we see your presenters mode. So if you go, yeah.
Okay.
Yes, now it's good.
Okay, but I have it on the wrong screen now. Anyway. Okay. Okay. Anyway. Yes, thank you very much, Kris, for this great introduction, basically to the topic, to the general challenges to integrate societal and climate futures, and that we need to move towards more integration and of social science and physical science. So in my presentation, I give examples based on a method called event-based storylines to, yeah, it's a way forward maybe to the integration of societal and climate futures. So if you think about climate and societal futures, and if you would ask the people around you that are not necessarily climate scientists, then you would get probably answers like, oh, I'm seeing a hot and very dry future, or even this future was presented to us many years ago. And what we also see is the voices of many young people that are worried about their climate futures. And it is upon us to imagine how we see our societal futures that can contribute to having not to worry basically about the climate futures. So societal and climate futures are closely connected. And we all are asked to imagine futures that are providing us with safe and societal and climate futures. But what we seeing often as in our science world is this as climate and societal futures. It's basically graphs that showing here the emissions pathways based on the representative concentration pathways, showing us scenarios for high emissions, for instance, or for low emissions that translate into corresponding global warming. Like, for instance, if we continue on the track we are on right now with the emissions, we end up in a 4-degree warmer world, as if we're transiting quickly to a low carbon society that gives us the chances to stay below 2 degrees. And we have associated with that also the shared socioeconomic pathways that describe our potential or plausible societal futures. The SSPs, who are narratives of, for instance, a sustainable future or a fossil fuel development-based future. And these days we are combining that in our climate and Earth system models, these scenarios in terms of simulations of the future. But actually, climate is not experienced as a long-term average or trend, but as weather or climate variability on a range of timescales, including our experience of extreme weather. And here you're seeing, for instance, an example where a certain climate variability outcome, like a circulation pattern. Here it's an atmospheric river that hit the Alps mountain in Europe and led to very heavy precipitation in a particular alpine valley, and that caused floods and landslide, basically great impacts to the people living there. And then the decision makers in that valley or in that area were challenged with coming up with adaptation measures, and they were questioning, is that a very likely event in the future? How often? What should we do to adapt to these events? And would there be events that are even larger in scale? And so this is a risk assessment in that sense, weighing off the plausibility or the possibility of such events coming again, and in connection with the vulnerability and exposure of the affected system. And that is also connected highly with the values and objectives that are associated with such systems. And in the recent years, I mean, this kind of concept was laid out by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change already in 2012 in the special report on extreme events. And in the recent years, this concept of risk was further developed, now also including the responses, our responses to climate change as part of being or causing or contributing to risk. So it's not only the impacts, but also our responses to climate change that can cause risk. And so if we follow this concept, then we have to also consider what Rowan Sutton has written in his paper in 2018, where he applies this basic logic of risk is the likelihood of an event to happen times the impacts. And he outlines that for a comprehensive risk assessment, we can not only look at the likely ranges that are often assessed in the IPCC report, the likely outcomes of the climate sensitivity or global temperatures associated with a certain scenarios, but we also have to look at the tails of the distribution, the unlikely events that are associated with often the highest impacts and thus the highest risk. So so decision relevant scenarios also need to look at these plausible, but maybe unlikely events with high risk. The IPCC's reports so far have presented a lot of climate information, but as Kris in her presentation said, it's often too broad for specific decision making. For instance, we have learned from recent and for past IPCC reports that with higher emissions, we get higher temperatures, like what you see in the upper plot. We have a temperature curve reaching up to 5 degrees for a high emission scenario, and we could, with a low emission scenario, stay below 2 degrees. And with increasing temperatures, we're shifting the distributions of many variables, for instance, temperature or precipitation, and thus increase the probability, the intensity also of extreme events. And also we know that if we own the uncertainties associated with these projections of climate change is in the next decade dominated by internal variability. And also in the next decades, 20 to 30 years, the model physics, the model uncertainty plays a big role. And the further we look in the future, of course, we don't know what pathways we choose. So the scenarios play a bigger role in what our future climate and societal future will look like. So, and the decision timeframes are not necessarily all by the end of century. It's often that decisions have to be taken within a year, months, a decade, and especially, for instance, for the agriculture or finance sector, the next years, 3 to 6 years, are crucial to know what will happen with the climate. But just to recognize that there are different dimensions or different time frames that decisions have to be made. And often in the IPCC report, we see these graphs, for instance, here for future changes in extreme precipitation, the wettest consecutive 5 days, often connected with flood events that are increasing. And for the highest emission scenario, we see that the extreme precipitation is 3 times higher than the mean precipitation increase. And we are seeing global maps, for instance, showing the geographical distribution of heavy increasing precipitation changes. But the reality of decision makers looks like this. For instance, here, a map of the Norwegian west coast with complex topography, small catchments, but high impact events have hit the country or this area in the recent decade, also causing fatalities. So how do these decision makers use the information that is provided in the reports to prepare for the future and to adapt to increasing precipitation? For this, we had this project called Translating Weather Extremes into the Future, based it on the Tales of Future idea from Hatzelegger et al. In 2015, where we took this high impact event and we used a model chain based on high-resolution Earth system model, a high-resolution weather model for the area, and an impact model simulating the floods in the future that are that the people are aware of that have hit in the past. And this was in close connection with the stakeholders to see if that kind of approach brings the climate future into a more graspable picture to them. But it's not only the observed events, it could also be what if events. For instance, if a tropical cyclone would hit Mumbai, a city with over 13 million inhabitants. And it is in this study by Adam Sobel, it is possible according to model simulation, but very unlikely to happen. But we just saw in the recent week that there was a tropical cyclone that basically missed Mumbai by only 150 kilometers. And if it had just taken a slightly different track, Mumbai would have been affected quite severely. And then the question is, are the stakeholders, are the decision makers prepared for that? Is the city prepared for such an event? So this brings me back to the beginning of having scenarios and storylines, and what are the connection between those. So emission scenarios, as we all know, are a plausible representation of future emissions. Shared socioeconomic pathways are based on narratives describing broad socioeconomic trends and also span a range of plausible futures. In the recent years, the term physical climate storylines has been more and more used in the physical science, especially, which are physically self-consistent unfolding of past events or plausible future events, putting emphasis especially on the understanding and plausibility of driving factors. For instance, climate or circulation patterns, or climate variability, how it turns out for a specific regions, for instance, causing more drying or wetting depending on the predominant circulation pattern. Such as, for instance, El Nino, southern oscillation, polar amplification, also atmospheric rivers. And then in the context of risk, we have used now this term event-based storylines, which are tailored narratives of a high impact event. So we're placing the impact event in the center of the event-based storyline. And this is often connected with a particular climate variability or climate circulation pattern. For instance, here the La Nina conditions leading to, for instance, severe droughts in some areas. And this will, of course, be affected by the emission scenarios, leading potentially to more intense events or more frequent, and then this associated with higher probability of extreme events, for instance, such as drought. But this is also, the event is also placed in the socioeconomic context, basically, because the impact depends on how vulnerable and exposed the system is. And that depends, of course, on the societal futures that we imagine for us to outplay. So to design event-based storyline, we, as I said, put on the front or in the center of attention is the climate impact, and that we can take from observed or from stakeholder experience, and we take, of course, we make plausible assumptions about what caused the hazard. And we acknowledge that there can be deep uncertainty, for instance, associated with the dynamic conditions. And then we use conditional explanation to shape basically the setting, the socio-economic setting that this hazard hits, and thus influences the impact, the consequences, the magnitude of consequences. And that such a storyline approach, descriptive storyline approach, we are using in the RECEED project, a EU-funded project, where we do risk assessment for different sectors like manufacturing, agriculture, finance. And we look at how external or remote climate extreme events can impact the sectors in Europe, and how this will change with different scenarios, ambitious Paris or for instance, a high warming world. And in the center of these storylines are always the stakeholders. Basing it on the narratives we hear from the stakeholders, and we had extensive workshops with the stakeholders, and we take up the insights we learn, and we complement them with our understanding of the social system, of the physical system, and our scenario world that we are using, the SSPs and RCPs. And then we support this by physically or using our models to help to support the storyline. And one example is the food security, the agriculture sector, where the stakeholders emphasized soybean as one interesting crop to look at, because there was this strong El Nino Southern Oscillation ENSO event in 2011-12 that caused tremendous decrease in crop yields in this region, and that was associated with ENSO and a long drought, intensive drought. And these drought risk areas are coinciding, of course, with the ENSO influence on this region. So we're building a storyline with the stakeholders, imagining, for instance, a different warming level where ENSO is more intense, where there are more La Nina or El Nino events, but also different socioeconomic scenarios that influence, for instance, the demand for dairy and meat in the EU. And as you all know, the soybean is very important to feed this livestock. And so this is how we place the physical change and the plausibility of extreme events like that have happened in the future context of this sector. Another sector is the finance sector. And this sector we have looked into detail in the ClimInvest project at CICERO. And this sector is very challenging, or is challenged with different risks associated with climate change. On the one hand, the physical risk due to the impacts of very extreme weather, for instance, on the assets, and the transition risk because the investment related to mitigation if we transit quickly to a low carbon economy. And so these potential financial impacts, they can, in the financial sector, can be associated with different sectors. And there's a pull and push between the mitigation investments and adaptation, because as much as you invest now in mitigation will help to lower cost and adaptation in the long term. But if you wait with mitigation investments, then you have higher cost and adaptation. So these trade-offs have to be understood by the stakeholders in the financial sector. So for that, CICERO colleagues were asked by the Kommunalbanken to develop a method to communicate the climate risk to Norwegian municipalities that, of course, make investments into adaptation and mitigation on the long term and short term. And so CICERO colleagues came up with 3 storylines for Norwegian municipalities that describe the socioeconomic and political climate-related conditions in Norway and globally. And they based it, their starting point, where the broader shared socioeconomic pathways in connection with, of course, the ambitions in the mitigation policies. And then they compared these different scenarios, for instance, taking the green road or taking the rocky road, in terms of how they would outplay in the physical risk from in the sector, or in the transition risk based on the carbon price, for instance. And so the stakeholders, the municipalities, try to imagine how their sector that they were most interested, so for instance, the shipping sector, would look like under these broader scale scenarios in the Norwegian context. And they came up with stories, for instance, for the green road, that they have succeeded in radical innovation in the sector, and that they have a sustainable shipping with making this a very profitable sector, in addition to being more resilient to extreme events, and also because it's a lower emission scenario, we would expect less extreme events, or the extreme opposite, that they have not succeeded with decarbonizing the sector. We still have high emissions, global warming, and also warming in Norway. The Arctic is increasing. And so there will be larger disruptions from extreme weather and costly. And in this context, having played with the imagination, having made those stakeholders understand the different outcomes of the broader scale scenarios for their sector, we can then place events like extreme weather, and when we can test, stress test basically if the sector is resilient towards different outcomes of climate in this imagined societal future, which hopefully also inspires to go towards the greener road, as it will hopefully be less costly and provide more opportunities to the sector. So to conclude, event-based storylines can be used to put SSPs and emission scenarios into local or regional context, and basically interpret those larger scale scenarios and refine them with the stakeholders together, communicating the risk and complex impact chains across sectors to stakeholders, tailored to their decision-making time frame. And also, it is meant to be that these event-based storylines are supported by model simulations, but not be driven by them. And finally, they provide an opportunity to connect also other goals, like the Sustainable Development Goals in this climate narrative, by exploring interconnected social and physical storylines. And with that, I thank you very much for listening, and this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jana. That was great. Yeah, so I see Kris is here now as well on camera. So with that, we basically have our panel together to actually move into some discussion. See if there are any questions from the participants. So please, if you have any questions, please raise your hand, and then we'll go into that. I have one question to get us started, actually, on both of your presentations. Actually, what the implications could be for the SSPs, in how can the SSPs be improved so that they can actually better support the research agenda that Kris laid out in the case of the US, and these specific climate storyline analyses that you explained, Jana. Is there anything in the SSPs that we say, oh, if we think about a next generation of them, if we start that discussion, what shall we definitely take on board or try to do better into the 2020s, so that we have this better body of research to assess by 2030? We start with Kris.
Yeah, thanks, Baz. It will not surprise you to find that the report aligns fairly closely with Brian's paper on what needs to be done with the SSPs, acknowledging the key research themes that came out of that paper. In terms of the decision-making, there's two elements. The first is that the IAMs do a really good job. They're getting even better at integrating across various sectors and issues. The paper a couple of years ago by Ed Byers, there's more work trying to integrate. And that theme is critically important. If I'm a governor of a state, I need to worry about what the risks are in my state. I need to know not the projections separately for water, for agriculture, for health. I need to know all of it together. I need to have information that will help me prioritize. And the second part, as both of us talked about, Jana and I spoke about is scale, that decision makers at all scales are requesting much more information, and helping decision makers with that more local scale information to the extent it's possible. I didn't mention, because I was covering the report, there's also growing interest under the UNFCCC in bringing in the SSPs into national adaptation planning. National adaptation planning, of course, has been primarily focused on climate projections, but the development choices in the low and middle income countries are so critical for what their risks are going to be into the future. So there are opportunities for all of us to think about using the SSPs in a variety of different contexts and bringing in more information that can be useful at all scales. Jana?
Yeah, thanks. That's great. I have some follow-up questions if there's no hands. First, Jana, and then I see actually there is a hand also from someone in the audience.
Yeah, yes, the paper that Brian wrote is, of course, contains already a lot of suggestions how to move forward, including also that regional aspects or reflections need to be taken into account in these SSPs. So it's also easier to interpret them regionally. And it's also a question, what we did with the event-based storylines is that we really downscale these scenarios, not only by creating these storylines for a particular context and region, but also by using high resolution Earth system models, using very high resolution weather models or models that are suited for the regions, and then impact models. So this model chain is important to put this, what you then get out, the impact is connected to what the stakeholder is used to. For instance, in our story, we used the flood model that is used by the operational flood forecast or flood warning system. And so what came out is something that they are used to, that are used operationally. So how can we use these more global scenarios or improve them so that they're really able to implement in this kind of model chains and interpretable then in that context. So I think this is there's a need for a dialogue between not only regional stakeholders, but also scientists that work on different levels of modeling, physical and social modeling, the IAMs, and so yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Gaurav, if I present that correctly.
So I just have one question, that because I have started working with these SSPs specifically with respect to India from last 2.5 years. So we were looking waste management trends and other trends. So my question is that, like, how much relevant, like after this pandemic, those existing GDP trends used in various SSP? This is one of the questions which strikes my mind. Like, all the global economies are at like different moves nowadays. So how much relevant are those SSP, and is it a time that we look into country or even within the country state or state specific and region specific SSPs or something like that?
Yeah, thanks for that. On the GDP question, I can tell you there's some work going on to develop a next set of GDPs that actually takes the more recent history in account, because of course the period from 2010 to 2020, especially 2020, has not been as expected before when the SSPs came out. Yeah, on indeed national level narratives, that resonates with both of your presentations, Kris and Jana. How divergent or important are those in your experience actually from the national or from the global narratives, and how important is it that we develop national and subnational scenarios and narratives especially?
Thank you.
I'm happy to start with that. We already, in a sense, have national narratives in national adaptation plans. That essentially all countries have national adaptation plans. And I think it's a real opportunity to think about putting together a proposal to get some funding to work with some countries on their national adaptation plans and bringing in the SSPs. That learning by doing, as we say in adaptation, would get us a long way forward, because we already have a lot of material to work with. And we know the stakeholders with whom we could work. So everything is pretty well set up. It's thinking about how some number of us could be involved in working again with those NAPs and seeing how they could be enriched in ways that would be useful for decision making.
Thank you.
Jana, did you want to add anything to that? Or?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I'm referring to what Kris said in terms of we need to go more and more towards a more systems thinking and cross-sector. I mean, it's of course good to have a national narrative or a national scenario for national adaptation plans, but as we do also in the RECEED project, it's not only one sector or one nation. We are so interdependent, so interconnected these days that we also need to connect these national narratives with the global storylines. And this is, I think, still a challenge. And I think we can learn from how the national stakeholders interpret the SSPs or criticize them that they are not correct or for their context or for their national GDP or past trajectory or future. So I think this has to be a mutual learning process to also bridge basically the scales and learn about the interconnection between sectors, nations, and to come up with more realistic risk assessment. Because if you see it only separated or basically national, I think we underestimate greatly the risk of a particular country or the opportunities for other countries. I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
And Boz, if I could add to that, something I've been thinking about that would be helpful is, I don't need to tell you how rich the SSPs are, and to think about putting together some four-page kinds of summaries of what do we see in the major trends in agriculture, for example. Because from the health side, when I start thinking about food security, it'd be really helpful just to have a really short summary of here's the trends in trade, for example, and it has this consequences for agriculture. Something that would be easy for people to pick up, because those global trends will be really important at the national level. You don't want people at the national level just making assumptions about agriculture, assumptions about water, only within their borders, because that will not accurately reflect the kind of challenges we're going to face. Alex, I was hoping I would provoke you.
Yeah, and I have to apologize. I was actually only able to join about 10 minutes ago, so I am admittedly jumping in after missing the presentations, which is a terrible thing to do. But you have successfully provoked me on this. So, Kris, we in AgMIP have done a big effort recently to build national integrated assessments. It's this kind of in-between scale. And one of the first things we asked of ourselves is, what type of information do we need from the global models? And it's a tricky question. I'm not sure we've come up with one answer, but it's definitely more than just prices. We're also interested in kind of trade imbalances, land use changes, and broader narratives. I'm a little bit hesitant to say what are the current trends, because we're looking a lot at how those trends are changing. Just a very simple example is bioenergy. If that takes off, it upends the entire cart. So I think there's some processes on this. We're trying to figure out how we can get our representative agricultural pathways to be kind of nested storylines. It's a little bit of an effort, I think, similar to bridging what we've just heard. But it's a challenge, because definitely at every layer you change the level of detail and the level of generality. So it's a challenge. But yeah, looking forward to following up more when I'm more cognizant of what everybody is presenting. Thanks.
Well, that was great, Alex. I really appreciate that. And it just illustrates how important it is to have this integration across sectors and to help people at the national scale understand that some of these international trends are going to be really important. And having the kinds of discussions that we're initiating here will be good to follow up on.
Yeah, and that's, I think we will have a future session actually also on using the SSPs across scales and the different methodologies that you have for that. But roughly speaking, you have the top-down approach where you just take the SSP narratives and then translate them to a certain city or region, and the bottom up where you first actually with stakeholders develop the narratives and then afterwards you map them to the SSPs. In a way, the top down in a way sounds very rigid, right? Where you and in the end, also in some of the applications that I've been involved in the end, the differences across cities are not then that different, because you always start from the global narrative and you translate it to you give it some local flavor, but not it's different amount of local flavor basically than when you do bottom up. But these big global trends that Alex and also you, Kris, just highlight, like, hey, these are important to take into account when you do your assessment on the local level. Those can always come basically from the global level, right? So what if in this situation, this scenario, actually biofuels indeed take off, even though at the moment when you as a stakeholder in that city would not consider biofuels as an important element of your narrative or of your analysis, but there can be many consequences of it taking off on the global level actually for your local situation.
And Alex, I see you have your hand up, and I'm going to take the prerogative of speaker and jump in first. To add to what you said, Boz, we've had this discussion before, is there's lots of efforts going on, particularly at city scales, to see if they can reach whatever their particular goals are, if it's net zero or whatever. For the few that I've looked at, I haven't looked at all the city efforts, they are not really taking into account technology change. And so there's opportunities to help for them to think through, if they're looking at current technologies and saying we can't really get our emissions down. But you can, if you start thinking about the technologies that are coming our way. Alex?
Yeah, thanks. And I see that Heike has just put a nice comment in the chat if people haven't seen it as well. But yeah, and I would just agree with what he said in his experience, or what was said in terms of the experience in the Finnish agriculture. Because yeah, the only way to do this, I think, is engagement with those local stakeholders in terms of what the national pathways and scenarios would look like. I just wanted to make a very quick comment, which was that one of the most fascinating things is to break the assumption that what is happening at the national level must be reflective of what's happening internationally. So we often make what we call a green road and a gray road, which is, not that different from a kind of sustainable orientation and an economic orientation, broadly speaking. But there's always this assumption that the green road must be correlated with one of the high sustainability SSPs globally. And that's, of course, not necessarily the case. There's some of the most interesting interactions are when the local efforts are counter to the global, which could exacerbate, but also create new advantages. If you are that one country that goes against the global trend, you can find yourself in an advantageous position. Or if you make the opposite decision, you can somehow end up in a more precarious situation. So those are interesting storylines, especially because oftentimes you're making the decision now and will find yourself in either that advantageous or disadvantageous position in 15 years.
Yeah, thanks. That's indeed, that's a good point. That's a very true combination of scenarios that is very interesting to look at. Maybe to wrap things up slowly, one final topic to actually look into is this, the role of social science and projecting vulnerability also into the future was also one of the recommendations under this section in the needs and achievements paper. Do we have enough there, do we have specific recommendations that we should follow into the future to improve this? And also especially thinking towards a little bit pulling this in the direction of likelihood. Because a lot of when the SSPs are criticized for likelihood, people always looking at the emission side and basically going after the RCPs and say, oh, the high end is not so likely, low end is not so likely, we are somewhere in the middle. But if you look at the whole framework, there are so many indicators that we make assumptions on that are varying across all of the narratives, rather extreme. Does it matter that when you go to the local level and you do these combined analyses, you bring together the climate and society, does the likelihood of certain of vulnerability projections in the future, does that matter in the end, or is it in the end really about the extremes when you have the conversations with the stakeholders, and is that what we care about?
Maybe I can start here, because what we experience with the event-based storylines, it's a lot about likelihood, because we are talking about, often we use it to talk about unlikely or very rare or very or just plausible events without putting a likelihood to it. But then the first question we get from a lot of stakeholders is, oh, but how likely is it? I mean, how is it that if it's not very likely, then I don't need to prepare for it? But this is, I mean, that's kind of the engineering approach of putting return values to everything, and then designing your infrastructure according to the return value. But there's another thinking about behind it, that where you don't need the likelihood, but it's the what if, the stress test, basically. And I think there the vulnerability, it can give you indications about how you can basically make your system, whatever you're thinking about when you take a decision now and thinking about vulnerability in the future and how you could improve it, is like you also gain something with being more resilient, more robust. If an extreme event hits in a scenario where I didn't improve my health system, or I improved my health system, and then the mega heat wave hits, and then I have more people taken care of than if I didn't have to that. So then it becomes a little bit relative, and I think the stakeholder then hopefully realizes that by turning on the vulnerability knob, there can be also great achievements be made in reducing risk, even though if there is an very unlikely event in that sense. But you also if you improve vulnerability, you also improve the social well-being in general often, and so you have co-benefits, even if this extreme event never hits.
Yeah, no, that's actually also an important point. Yeah, there are benefits of improving resilience and reducing vulnerability, even in the absence of the event hitting you.
And I'd like
Kris?
to add to that, I really support Jana's comments about stress testing. I think stress testing is incredibly important. And this is another area where we've got some real opportunities. There's been so much work within sectors looking at vulnerability, but we really haven't looked at the co-evolution of those vulnerabilities. Jana mentioned I've been doing quite a bit of work on health systems and thinking about how the SSPs could affect the health systems. And when you look at much of the work, not all of the work, of course, but you look at much of the work that's been done in adaptation planning, there's often an implicit assumption that current vulnerability stays the same. And that's the least likely outcome. Our health systems evolve all the time. And so how do you think, it's just like with the climate, you've got an evolving baseline. The health systems are going to continue to change. They can get better, they can get worse. And so there's been some thinking done in the health sector about that evolution of vulnerability, but how does that co-evolve with vulnerability to food security, to water security? Yeah. And bringing all of what we understand so far about vulnerabilities, thinking about that co-evolution is a place where I think it'd be very helpful for us to go with the SSPs. And that would be incredibly helpful for decision makers at any scale to have that thinking brought together. So as usual, Boz, we end up with more things that we could do.
Of course, but if we have done it all, then we are just done and we can retire. But we're not that far yet. Yeah, we've also reached the top of the hour. I see some people actually leaving. I'm gonna thank both Jana and Kris for great presentations and very good discussion afterwards. This has been a very nice edition of the of the Iconics webinars.